Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me, frankly, for 3 shows that we're very fortunate to have done with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy of District 6 here in Louisiana. You know, we have elections coming up in November 6th, and we want to make sure that you folks are making educated decisions when you vote, that you know what the issues are. So Bill and I discussed all the big issues ranging from the jobless state that a lot of us find ourselves in, to the huge debt that we have, to immigration policy, national security issues. So join us on the next Legal Lines with our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and we're very pleased to have on the show today our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy. Bill, it's great to have you back.
Hey, Locke, thank you for having me.
Well, man, a lot's happened. I know we spent a little bit of time discussing before the show. You have been in Congress during one of the most just tumultuous times in the history of the United States. It's certainly in the most recent past. District 6 is what, 750,000 folks?
Yes.
And you basically came in when President Obama came in.
Correct.
Tell the folks kind of how things have shifted from between 2008 and here we are, fall of 2012.
So, Locke, it's interesting. People say, well, Congress can't make up their mind, can't get along. But if you think about it, in 2008, the American people voted for a president who was liberal. In 2010, in reacting against that, they voted for a Congress which is conservative, a House of Representatives. So, if you will, in 2008, left, 2010, right. In 2012, the American people make up their mind. The conflict in Congress, if you will, reflects kind of how the American people haven't quite decided where they want our country to go. I'm hoping we continue to go to the right, but that election will be in this November.
And Bill, so because people hear the terms go right, go left, moderate, conservative, all that stuff. Really what we're talking about is a difference in philosophy of how the United States, America's people want to be governed.
Correct. If you will, the president's vision is that you give up a little bit of your freedom, you give up a little bit of your money in higher taxes, and you rely upon the government to take care of you. There may be more equality because taxes are higher. There will be less growth because taxes are higher.
And that's what's going on in Europe. I mean, you can see what happens with that type of government.
Yes. On the right, you would say, wait a second. We trust that the small businesswoman is better able to make decisions regarding how she is going to grow her business than is Washington, D.C. So let her keep her money, use it to employ people as she sees fit, and put her in a lower regulatory environment. Now, frankly, there's going to be different levels of growth because you want that small businesswoman's, you want her to be rich. You want her to become so successful that she takes her business employing 6 people and have it employ 300. Because those 300 families then benefit.
Their boat rises.
The boat rises. But those are 2 different visions about how our country should go
forward. And so what we're talking about is really how each philosophy deals with the freedom of the individual and the use of the resources of people power and the resources of the state or the country in this case.
And I think the president truly thinks that that small businessman or small businesswoman didn't build it. It's his understanding of how our economy works, that government is so integral to how this couple, this family, this whatever builds their small business, that they really have this obligation to give back so that government can decide how to help others. Now, clearly we need police and we need roads, etc. But if you talk to that small businesswoman or that small businessman, they put long hours in, they sacrifice, they sometimes go bankrupt, get back on their feet, and then succeed. They would say, wow, we did it oftentimes not with government's help, but despite the government putting obstacles in front of us.
Well, and it's interesting because what we're talking about is who is in the best position to more efficiently and effectively and economically and productively use the resources of individuals and money, frankly.
Right.
And the right or the conservative side would say, we trust the individuals in the capitalist system to properly allocate where a service or product should be created or given, and how much to dedicate to it, how much money, how many people to put in there. And if the public responds, then they'll do more. If they don't, they'll do less, or it'll go bankrupt, like you say. And because the money we send to the government via taxes is our money.
Right.
It's not like the government is
Right.
out running a business and that's their profit margin. They take money from the private sector and then they give it back via the states and the cities, but with strings and conditions that limit the way that it can be used. It doesn't allow as much freedom on how it would be used by the system. Is that right?
Whenever somebody says, oh, the government gave it to us and so therefore it's free. No, it's not free. It was extracted from another taxpayer. Maybe the same taxpayer, but it just goes through Washington and comes back.
Right.
A more efficient system is if you keep that money and you can use it to expand the private sector. I'm struck. China, communist China, decided to become more prosperous and lift poor people into being middle class into being upper middle class. They didn't do it through more government regulation and higher taxes. That was their old system. Now they're giving more freedom, and as they give more freedom with lower taxes, their people are rising in economic well-being.
And I guess when I hear talk that, we wouldn't have created our businesses but for the government. I mean, the government built what they were supposed to, and they used the taxes we paid them.
Yes.
And we're the sources of the funds.
And government clearly has a role.
Sure,
We need
absolutely.
police, defense. We need highways. We want our universities to have strong research programs because those come back to benefit us. But the question is how the extent of government. Should government be picking winners and losers? In the case of the Obama administration, taking a heck of a lot of taxpayer dollars and putting it towards things like Solyndra.
The green energy industry,
Yeah.
let's say.
Of
which Solyndра's one.
Of which Solyndра's one. Not in R&D, which we can accept that maybe research and development is one thing, but in an actual commercial enterprise where you have people who are stockholders who serve to benefit. The president's vision is yes, we should. The Republican vision would be, heck, we'll help you on the research and development, but whether it succeeds in the marketplace is really up to your business model. And if it works, it does, and if not, that's just the result of your business model.
And so in our example, what we're talking about is more government control of the resources. In that example, the government decided the green industry with Solyndra solar panels, we're going to choose that industry, solar panels. And not only did they just choose the industry where to pour resources into, but then they chose who was going to provide that product. And that is a greater amount of control than is normally exhibited in the past anyway.
You mentioned earlier, Locke, about how it's hard for government to make as wise decisions in the marketplace. There were people in the solar panel industry that knew that Solyndra was going to have problems with their business model. It was actually predicted by some that they would go bankrupt, I think, in September 2011. Nonetheless, the Obama administration made the decision, despite that, to front them $500 million. They went bankrupt right on schedule.
And that was our money.
And that was our taxpayer money, $500 million. Again, not on research and development, but on bringing to market something which the marketplace was not ready for.
And the bottom line is the government does not have the forces to make sure that it does efficiently and effectively make sure resources are going where they need to, because there's no consequences if they fail. For example, Solyndra went belly up almost exactly when it occurred or was predicted to occur. And there's no consequence to the government except perhaps politically. But nobody lost money, nobody's job was laid off, all of that kind of stuff, where the government folks suffered the consequence.
Yes, and so, but on the other hand, we know the economy suffered.
Yep.
Instead of that $500 million being used productively, either to let the taxpayer keep it to make better decisions, it now has been dissipated, wasted, lost.
All right, we're going to continue this on the next segment of Legal Lines. We're very pleased to have our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. Again, I'm very pleased to have on the show today our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. Again, Bill, thanks so much for coming back. We were talking about kind of the difference of philosophy of the liberals or left and conservatives or right. And one of the components is the left would say we want more government involvement, and conservatives, right, would say less. Explain how that played out for you from 2008 through to date, because a lot of changes have occurred politically.
So in fairness to the American people, when they voted in 2008 for President Obama, he told them, let's talk about health care briefly. I think we may come back to it
Sure.
later, but it was the issue that dominated 2008. He said that, listen, without an individual mandate, we're going to pass a bill which covers all Americans and will lower the average family's premium by $2,500 a year. Now, I'm sitting there thinking, I've been in healthcare for 20 years, I don't see how you're going to do this. But the president made that pitch, and it passed. But it was very clear he could not fulfill those promises. What passed is something which has, now you're going to think I'm making this up, but one of the federal agencies that reviewed the legislation, the President's Health Care Plan, Obamacare, is that it has innumerable boards, bureaucracies, and commissions. Another set over 150 boards, bureaucracies, and commissions. Tremendous expansion of government. There's $500 billion in new taxes over 10 years. Now, and by the way, insurance premiums have risen 10% since the law passed. They have not fallen by $2,500. There is an individual mandate, although now it's based upon a tax. So it's an incredible expansion of government, with the fingers of government coming more and more into our life than ever before, and the control exerted over businesses and individuals at its greatest level ever. And the president thinks this is a fantastic bill.
And it represents 1/6 of the entire United States economy.
Which the government now regulates in ways it always did, but even more so now. I'm a freedom person. I'm a doctor who works in a public hospital for the uninsured.
Okay, long for 20 years, right?
A safety net hospital, but I will still say you better preserve someone's health by giving them more freedom in the long run than kind of putting them under government control. And so in 2008, that's what was ushered in, and through 2008, 2010, this great expansion of government taxes and government bureaucracy and government control occurred. 2010, the American people said, no, we don't want that. Probably started with Scott Brown's election to replace Teddy Kennedy. So the American people said no. So in 2010, there's been an effort to push back. But as long as Harry Reid is president of the Senate and Barack Obama is president of the United States, there's only so far you can go to push back, because they are going to stop anything that rolls back the expansion of government that occurred in the previous 2 years.
And let's educate folks real fast on why that is the case. Remember, our founding fathers chopped up the power of the government into 3 branches. You have the presidency, you have the Congress, which is broken up again into a House, who are elected every 2 years, who's a part of the membership elected every 2 years, and then you have the Senate, who are elected every 6 years, and then you had the judiciary. And in 2008, the Democrat Party controlled every branch of government that would pass legislation. And then in 2010, the House was taken over by Republicans, but still Democrats controlled the presidency and the Senate, of which you indicated Harry Reid is the leader. And so without having enough power to do anything except stop the continuation of the expansion of government, the Republicans and the conservatives, or however you want to state it, have basically, their number one job was to prevent from an expansion of government.
Now let me credit the American people, because in 2010 the Tea Party movement came up and said, listen, we need to stop the spending. So the deficit is the greatest issue facing our country right now.
Amen.
And
it's
so
unbelievable.
The American people rose up and they said, this has got to stop. We need a new way to do things. And frankly, the discussion changed from how much can we spend which was occurring when it was Pelosi, Reid, and President Obama, to now, wait a second, we need to actually pay down our debt, put ourselves on a sustainable fiscal course in a way which preserves safety net programs but doesn't bankrupt future generations. And that was the American people putting the conservative movement, Republicans, back in the House, but the American people saying it's got to change. I'm very impressed with the American people.
Well, I love the fact that the system's working. It takes time, but it's working. It's why we have power chopped up.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the fact that the number one issue, you mentioned debt, it's really, the debt is part of the economy, affecting the economy, is jobs. We have millions and millions and millions of people who cannot work, and because, therefore, millions and millions receiving federal benefits because they got to eat. Explain the quandary that we're in.
Yeah, right now, in 2007, we had maybe this many jobs with a 6% unemployment rate. Now we have fewer jobs to be had, but there is still maybe an over 8% unemployment rate.
8.3 as of last month, right?
So there's both a higher unemployment rate, but fewer jobs anyway. There are more people who have been out of work for 2 years than I think we've had in the history of our country, or maybe since the Great Depression. So we've got to recreate these jobs, and not just service jobs, which can be good, but also manufacturing jobs and construction jobs and mining jobs, which have not only good wages but good benefits. Those are the sorts of jobs that bring middle-class prosperity. Those are what we need more of, and frankly, there's a difference of philosophy over that. The president thinks, again, more government intervention will get us there. Republicans are saying, well, let's do things like Keystone XL pipeline, drilling for gas and oil in the outer continental shelf and on federal lands inshore, expand our use of our own natural resources, and we will recreate and strengthen that middle-class prosperity.
In fact, discuss the fact that if we would reduce the amount of regulation on the energy industry and allow them to outsource the resources that we have, and the fact that we could improve the refining capacity, how many millions of jobs that would create?
So we've already done that despite what the government's doing, but all of us in Louisiana are familiar with the BP oil spill.
Right.
How terrible that was.
Right.
But I remember one of the widows of one of the men who died came to Washington and said, please don't do this moratorium. There are so many jobs, people I know that are affected by this. Please don't do that. Now, we know those jobs are rarely for the petroleum engineer. They're actually for this kind of blue-collar guy or gal who's making enough money to feed his family, have good benefits, send their child to school, buy a new truck. Now, that moratorium for 6 months and the slowdown afterwards,
And then permittatory,
yeah, not only decreased the number of jobs available, but it also decreased our access to our own natural resources.
which forces us to buy oil and energy from folks who don't like us a whole lot.
So the reason we're so threatened by Iran maybe closing down the Straits of Hormuz is because we're still dependent upon Middle East oil. The more we produce domestically, the more we can weather somebody in the Middle East who decides to go after us.
And so the question is, in this regard, can the government create more jobs? And I would argue, based on the very recent past history where well over $1 trillion was supposed to make that happen, that isn't going to happen. And do we trust the private sector to do that? So we'll discuss this on the next segment. We'll be right back. This is Locke Meredith with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, very pleased to have on the show today our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. Bill, let's dive right into it. So what we're talking about is there anything the government can do to help the private sector increase the number of jobs that are available? And contrary to that, is there something that the government can do or does do that reduces the ability of the private sector to create very much needed jobs?
Pick up where we were last segment. The regulatory environment has decreased drilling off the Louisiana Outer Continental Shelf. That has destroyed lots of jobs. Rigs have moved overseas. If they allow those rigs to take place, still making sure we have an environmentally sound policy, but don't regulate out of existence jobs that are there, you're going to have more jobs. Similarly, the Keystone XL pipeline, it's not happening right now. It's hard to say it's a regulation. That is just a statement, this shall not go forward. If the president would say, listen, we already have a pipeline coming from down there, it was about to be approved before I put the nix on it, let it go forward, we would create 20,000 jobs directly, maybe 100,000 jobs indirectly.
And provide more energy that we need and not have to buy from folks who don't like us.
Domestic oil and gas, sure, it's from Canada, but on the other hand, if we buy Canadian oil, I'm told that 80% of their dollars will come back to the United States. If we buy oil from Saudi Arabia, that number is 40%. So even though we're buying outside of our country, 80% of those dollars contribute to the North American economy.
And from what I've read, because the president said, nope, not letting the pipeline come through, China immediately began negotiations with Canada and its oil-producing companies, and has entered into a partnership and is going to start getting their oil instead of us.
So the fallacy is, I think the president thinks that if we don't build that pipeline, that the oil will never be produced. It's going to be produced. It's just going to go to the Pacific Ocean and shipped to China to create permanent manufacturing jobs to be exported across the world, instead of being shipped to the Gulf Coast to create permanent manufacturing jobs to benefit both us and the rest of the world.
And of course, the cost of the energy is going to be higher, which means folks will be paying more at the gas pump.
And the environmental footprint will be worse, because not only are you shipping it through a pipeline, but you are also sending it across the ocean, burning fuel, to get it to a place with laxer environmental standards.
Let's talk about the coal industry, because as I understand it, regulation is not just of the oil producing companies, but it's of the coal, which again is used to produce electricity. Explain to the folks where we are in that regard.
50% of the electricity produced in the United States or thereabouts is from coal-fired plants. Now, the administration, frankly, does not like coal. And so they don't like its carbon footprint, they don't like its particulate matter. Now, which is bad for asthmatics. As it turns out, the industry has made great strides in both having more efficiently burning coal electrical producing plants, if you will, as well as taking care of the soot that comes out. So you go by a coal-fired plant and it's a nice place around it. The administration wants to take it to such a degree that it's going to be difficult for coal-fired plants to stay in business.
In fact, I've read hundreds.
Oh yeah, they'll be folded, and so electricity costs will go up. The coal will still be burned. What they'll do with the coal is they'll ship it overseas.
Just like the oil from Canada.
Just like the oil from Canada. So our worldwide carbon footprint remains about the same. It's just that the people who are producing that coal lose their jobs and we pay more for electricity.
Not what we need.
Not what we need.
Let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about, so the bottom line is, regarding that discussion, government to help industry, private sector generate more jobs is to reasonably and adequately regulate it, but not over-regulate it, and certainly not eliminate the ability of the industry to provide for needs.
Don't pick winners and losers. Within a set of sound environmental principles, allow the marketplace to sort it out.
Trust the marketplace.
Trust
the individuals.
Yes.
All right, let's shift gears to debt, because debt is such a huge deal. You indicated that the Tea Party grew out of the great concern that we have for the debt being taken on by the government, because frankly, I love my kids and I'm gonna love my grandbabies, and the government is spending today and giving the credit card to my kids and my grandbabies, and they're gonna have to pay it off.
You have a great way of putting it. You mentioned if we took the debt that's coming up and we split it into everybody's credit card. Do you mind sharing that again? Because I thought that was a nice analogy.
Well, it's just that the bottom line is the government is borrowing money from folks today. China, frankly, the federal government, the Fed Reserve, is lending with its right hand what the other part of the government's taking with its left hand. They bought 63% of the debt sold by the Treasury Department on this last sale, as I read it. So they're borrowing money, and they're then given the credit card that has a balance due of $40 or $50 or even $60,000 to our kids and our grandbabies. A newborn baby born today gets a credit card from the federal government and owes around $50,000 to $60,000. That's wrong.
That is wrong. We are mortgaging our future. When we talk about freedom, we have to realize there's economic freedom as well. So if you take a young person graduating from college, and already she is paying more, he is paying more because under the President's health care plan, they're going to be required to pay more for their health insurance. And there are going to be future tax obligations because of this debt that you just described. You're really limiting their economic freedom. If they want to start a business in the future and they need startup capital and they hope to self-generate it, if they're paying higher taxes, they are less able to do so. So economic freedom is part of what we should be promoting. Because we know that young man or young woman graduating from college, we want them to have the idea that they then implement through hard work that then creates prosperity for thousands of other families. Think Bill Gates or Michael Dell creating computer companies or software companies that then created so much benefit for the rest of society. The more you infringe upon that person's economic freedom, the less she is able to do that. We need to restore that economic freedom.
And so not only do we not have jobs when, and I think Robert Reich, who was President Clinton's Secretary of Labor, told college graduating class recently, you're, quote, screwed, because 50% of grads from the previous year hadn't found a job.
Yes, and so now, first, let me just say, I still believe in the American system. So I still think that those young graduates, if they have a marketable degree, will be able to use their creativity and go out and start a business. But you have to give them that vision.
And if it's not overregulated.
And so the more you talk to small business people, and they will tell you it's harder and harder for them to start. So to kind of continue our conversation, it is harder for that young person to become the entrepreneur because of the regulatory environment.
Right.
It is harder for them to get the capital because of uncertainty about tax code.
And they have debt, student debt.
And they carry forward the debt. We need to pull back both upon that regulation and restore their economic freedom so that that young person with a good idea can bring it to fruition, benefiting the rest of society.
And create jobs, which is what we need so badly. Let's talk about the effect of the Federal Reserve. I'm not sure many folks understand really what all takes place there, but the bottom line is, you know, we've talked about how the government can borrow money, but they can also print money.
Right.
Discuss that for the folks.
Well, right now, the Ben Bernanke, who has the Federal Reserve, in an effort to prop up the economy, is making interest rates very low. If you are which effectively expands money supply, the mechanism by which he's doing this. If you are a saver, if you've been saving your whole life and you're now 65 or 70 years old with your bank account, your interest rate on your bank account is very low. If you will, that is a penalty.
Right.
And it's eating into your ability to finance your retirement.
And retirees can't live on it anymore. We'll continue this when we do the next show. I want to thank you for being with us on Legal Lines today, and our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me, frankly, for 3 shows that we're very fortunate to have done with our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy of District 6 here in Louisiana. You know, we have elections coming up in November 6th, and we want to make sure that you folks are making educated decisions when you vote, that you know what the issues are. So Bill and I discuss all the big issues ranging from the jobless state that a lot of us find ourselves in, to the huge debt that we have, to immigration policy, national security issues. So join us on the next Legal Lines with our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, I'm very pleased to have on the show today our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. This is really a continuation of a show we did previously. Again, Bill, appreciate you doing this.
Thank you, Locke.
And I want to point out, because we talked about this, there seems to be so much division in America, and this show is not about trying to divide people or talk about the divisions between people. It's to educate folks so that they can make an educated decision when they vote.
Yeah, right now, the issues before our country are huge. Now, I think that the group with the best answer should win, but it has to be an answer that builds upon the facts. The
Truth.
It can't be opinions. This is where I want it to be. It has to be the truth. And so this is a great program because this is part of our national dialogue, and this is what we got to work through.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Let's dive back into it. We talked about how the economy is growing at less than 2%. I think 1.5 was the most recent estimate that where we are. That doesn't even generate enough growth where new jobs are created. You can't find jobs. You got this huge debt load hanging over your head, personal and the government's. And then we're talking about how the federal government literally can print dollar bills to fund its borrowing. Talk to the folks about the effect of that on them.
Well, there is a weakening of our currency, and so so the dollars you hold are less valuable. Again, we mentioned last time, if you're a saver and the interest rate declines because the Fed decides to use a lower interest rate, then you are getting less return on your dollar. Therefore, you have less money off your savings to finance your retirement. So in that, we need to find ways to strengthen our economy, to increase the value of our property, if you will, to make us a more prosperous people.
You know, Bill, it's interesting because you and I have discussed before that by printing more dollar bills, I mean, let's say we had $1 trillion and that they've printed 2 more trillion, okay? Let's say before they printed that additional money, they could have bought a candy bar for $1. Well, now because there's 3 times more money, it takes $3 to buy that candy bar. Did that candy bar increase in value? No. It just required $3 more because the dollar bill had been devalued. And that's happening not only to every U.S. citizen, but every human being in government who's holding dollar bills.
So
it's a tax. It's a hidden tax.
And one of the times past when our price of oil was going up, which was affecting the gasoline price at the pump, if you looked at the price of oil in euros, it was pretty constant. If you looked at the price of oil in dollars, it was rising.
That's right.
Really, it wasn't the price of oil moving, it was the price of our dollar.
Was less valuable.
Less valuable. So we were paying more at the pump, therefore had less money to do other things. I work at Earl K. Long Hospital. I would have patients missing their appointment because they could not afford $4 gasoline to get from Livingston Parish to Earl K. Long Hospital. So that has real life family consequences.
That's right.
When this occurs.
Because now it costs more to buy anything. In fact, China and those countries that were holding dollar bills as a place to safely store their wealth, they've gotten so aggravated about the devaluing of the dollars they had, they've started negotiating with other countries and not using dollar bills to trade.
Right.
It used to be all countries traded with each other using the United States dollar bill. They're starting to no longer use it because it's a reflection that you're getting screwed if you hold a dollar bill.
But Locke, to bring it back to what we spoke of earlier, the more domestic oil and gas production we have, the less we buy from, say, OPEC nations, the stronger our currency becomes. Not only that, but instead of employing people in OPEC nations to produce that oil and gas, we're employing Americans or North Americans to produce that oil and gas, who then spend their money in our country.
Right.
We've actually taken, under our energy policy that was basically put in place by George W. Bush, the amount of OPEC oil we import has gone from 66% of our nation's oil use down to around 40%, a dramatic decline in 4 to 6 years. Now, President Obama speaks about how this occurs, but he neglects to say that it occurred because of George Bush's policies.
Right.
But if we take that up even more, not only do we create American jobs, better wages, but we also change that balance of payment so that the money stays here stateside. That should be a Republican, it is a Republican alternative to President Obama's energy policy, which I think creates better jobs, better benefits, and strengthens the dollars that we have.
You know, I think of the dollar bills like a share of stock.
Right.
And the dollar bill reflects the value of the country. The same way a share of stock reflects the value of a company and its assets. And so when the United States is doing poorly, the value of that dollar bill goes down. Or if we decide to do a stock split, a dollar bill split, and print more of them, it's not that it's worth more, it's actually worth less. Let's talk about
I like that analogy. I'm going to steal it from you.
Well, you're welcome to. But not only are we being taxed in essence because they're taking away the value of the dollar bill, but the literal value of the assets we hold, the houses that we own, the property own, has been decreased by 40 to 50%. Explain to the folks.
Yeah, after the housing bubble occurred, and since then our economy is slowing down, there is less value in our economy. The average family's net assets are down 30 to 50%, which means that you have that much less saved for your retirement, that much less in your child's college fund, you name it. So clearly that has a negative effect on the overall economy. We need to once again get Americans with those better jobs, better wages, better benefits, so that we can again begin to increase the value of our nest eggs, not decrease it.
In fact, Bill, I read recently that the Canadian citizen has more wealth than the United States citizen.
You know, it's interesting thing about Canada is that they have developed their own natural resources, their timber resources, their oil and gas resources, where under this president we've had a real negative development, an attempt to inhibit the development of our own natural resources. They are doing what we in Louisiana know that we as Americans should do.
Let's talk about the fact that because houses have lost their value or properties have gone down in value, that folks are underwater on their mortgages. I mean, the foreclosure rate is sky high, and they're still holding back inventory of houses that they want to put on the market because they don't want to drive the prices down even further. Explain the quandary we're in.
Two parts to that. After the housing bubble burst, there was lots of homes on the market that had been purchased at, say, $200,000. But then when the bubble burst, they were reassessed and they were only $125,000. If you bought at $200,000, either you're going to walk on your loan or you're going to be paying more for a house which is worth less. That takes up the disposable income that you could be using elsewhere. It's also had a negative effect. Blue-collar workers are traditionally employed in construction, mining, and manufacturing. A lot of that construction is home construction. So as long as you have this inventory hanging over,
everybody's going to build a house.
Kids have moved in with their parents as opposed to buying a home for themselves. We need them moving out of their parents' home, buying their own home. I think the parents are probably like that. But that in turn creates that demand for construction jobs.
Right.
And so we need those housing starts up, but it has to be a function of a vibrant economy, not just here's a free check, go get a house.
And of course, housing is a big component. Construction and manufacturing of the products needed to construct the homes is a big component of our whole economy. And as you're indicating, that's in dire straits right now.
Yeah, and we need that to recover.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Taxes. We are hearing these days that we have a tax cliff that we're getting ready to fall off of. Tell the folks what we're talking about.
Yeah, the Bush tax cuts are set to expire. The president does not want to extend them all.
All right, let's continue that on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith on Legal Lines, and with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. We have Bill Cassidy, our United States Congressman, and we're talking about some very important issues so you can decide how you're going to vote in the next election. Bill, let's just dive right back into it. We're talking about the cliff that we read about these days that happens January 1, 2013.
Yes.
Tell the folks what we're talking about.
In a recession about 10 years ago, the Bush administration put forward some tax cuts. Their idea being that would be a true stimulus, not where government picks winners or losers, but where individuals could take that money and purchase what they need for their home or to
invest it
or to expand their business. Now, those tax cuts were set for 10 years. they're about to expire.
Well, actually, I think recall serves that they were to expire in 2010.
2010.
And President Obama and the Congress agreed to extend them for 2 years.
Correct.
And in fact, I think President Obama said you shouldn't raise taxes during a recession.
Now, we're still in a very weak recovery. Ben Bernanke and Bill Clinton, as well as almost universally Republicans, are saying we are still in a recovery situation where we should not raise taxes.
Yeah, I'm not sure the folks out there are going to say we're in any recovery at all. But,
I agree with
but
that.
I understand that's a technical term for economists.
Technical term. The president, kind of election year politicians, election year politics, is saying, wait a second, we want millionaires to pay a tax, increase taxes, and he defines a millionaire as a couple earning more than $250,000 per year.
And if you're single, it could be 200.
If you're single, it could be 200.
But if you're married and both of you working, you only get 50,000 bump.
There's a little bit of a marriage penalty.
You think?
Okay, so if you're living together out of wedlock and you're making $250, you're better off. And I hate to say it, but
That's the truth.
that's the truth. So not only is there a marriage penalty, but 50% of those who would pay higher taxes are small business people who file under Subchapter S, who will make a decision, do I pay higher taxes or do I use that money to invest in my business?
And those small businesses, and we talked about this before, and everybody admits it, are the ones who produce 70% of jobs.
Correct. And so we spoke about economic freedom, and an individual having the economic freedom to expand her business in the way that she thinks that she would like to. Again, 50% of those who will pay higher taxes under the president's proposal are these small business people. And they will not be able to use those assets to expand their jobs as they would otherwise.
And they're not doing it.
Right.
I mean, growth is 1.5%.
Right now, the uncertainty has them holding back. Before I make a long-term decision, let me see what happens. The president wants to raise my taxes.
And take my money.
And take my money, so I cannot invest now.
And create jobs.
And money is on the sidelines because of it. Jobs are not being created.
Well, let's talk about what the president is saying he's going to do with those increased taxes. I mean, I'm under the impression that he's saying we need to pay our fair share because we recognize how bad this high deficit is and this high debt level that we have on every United States citizen. You're telling me that's not what he plans on doing with the money.
If you catch the president on the right day, he will admit that the amount of money raised from these taxes will not make a long-term impact upon the debt. What he's saying is that it's an issue of fairness. Even though the top 1 to 5% of people pay most of our income taxes, 50% of Americans pay no income tax, federal income tax whatsoever, that even though they're already paying a large amount, a large percent, they should pay more out of fairness. He says that, number one. And number two, he kind of has a verbal sleight of hand. It's not going to be used to pay down the debt. It's going to be used to finance more public spending so that we don't have to borrow money and add to the debt to pay for that same public spending.
So we're going to tax you more so I don't have to borrow more.
To pay for the programs that I'm going to do anyway.
That I want to keep.
Yeah, so he would rather use the federal government. He would rather the federal government tax a small businesswoman to use that money to spend on something the federal government wants to spend it on, as opposed to allowing her to keep the money and to grow the economy. Republicans say, let her keep that money. We have more jobs net if she invests than if your administration makes the decision as to where to invest.
Let's talk about the other options because, to address the debt, you can quit borrowing, at least it doesn't keep going up, and to reduce it, you can actually start paying it off by reducing your spending, right?
Yes, well, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can raise taxes, assuming that doesn't negatively impact growth, but there's a lot of evidence that it does.
And you apply it towards the debt.
And you apply it to the debt. You can decrease spending, and then you can grow the economy. Clearly, we have to have a growth in the economy, not only because it's a nice way to get rid of the debt, but it's a nice way to bring prosperity back to American families.
I mean, Bill, everything I'm reading is indicating from the economists that there's no way we could tax the wealthy enough to get rid of the debt.
You could confiscate their wealth. You could just go and say, give us all your money, and you would not make the impact upon the debt that we need to as a nation. It's not that we're undertaxed. It's that we have these drivers of our indebtedness that are being unaddressed. The president is not acknowledging that when he speaks to the American people. If you will, he's being less than honest with us.
And what we're talking about is the drivers are being the social programs, the entitlement programs, And of course, we've discussed this earlier, but they've been hugely expanded. We have a huge portion of our population who is at the poverty level now, and we have a huge portion of our population who are receiving food stamps and other forms of government assistance. I mean, you indicated it earlier, almost 50% of folks don't even pay federal taxes, income taxes, and almost 50% of folks are receiving benefits from the federal government. We're at a cliff that we're going to fall off, and the goose is going to get killed.
Yes, and that kind of, again, to bring back some of our earlier segments, there's a way out of it. Again, the road to recovery goes through energy. If we produce, as one example, not the only example, but it's the one we're so familiar with here, if we produce our own natural resources like oil and gas, we create jobs in mining to bring the oil and gas up, jobs in construction to build the pipelines to the petrochemical plants which are expanded for increased input, and jobs in manufacturing, we need jobs there. We also, by the way, bring jobs back from China. If you look at a steel mill, their cost is raw material, labor, and energy. We can never beat them on the cost of labor, but we can bring our energy costs so low that they bring that plant back here to build steel here and not there. And we're actually seeing a renaissance in manufacturing because of our lower energy cost. That's natural gas, not solar. We can do that, we can have growth, important for families, important for jobs, important for getting rid of our debt.
You know, Bill, I've had Dr. Lawrence Scott, Professor Emeritus from LSU, and he's indicated that the number 2 producer of revenues for the federal government are the taxes paid by the energy industry, second only to income taxes that everybody, 50% of the folks pay. Mm-hmm. It's a huge way to help our government get out of this mess and help our nation. Let's shift gears a little bit. Because we're talking about taxes, let's talk about Obamacare, because it does implement a tremendous amount in taxes. It implements a tremendous amount in regulation. And let's talk about the effect of it on just the freedom of individuals for health care.
Yeah, $500 billion in new taxes over 10 years are part of the President's health care package. It greatly expands the size of government and greatly expands the role of government in an individual's life. Now, if your goal is to expand access to health care at an affordable cost, it may look good on paper, but my practical experience working at Earl K. Long Hospital is that the way to make things better is to give more power to the patient, not to a bureaucrat.
All right, well, let's continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. Our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy, will be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. We have on the show today Bill Cassidy. He's our United States Congressman, District 6. And we're trying to educate you folks so you can make a wise decision come this election on November 6th. Bill, let's talk about Obamacare. You're a physician. You've dealt with the needy your whole professional life. You've taught at the medical school. You've worked at Earl K. Long for over 20 years. Why do you not like Obamacare?
Yeah. When you have reform, you want to have the patient in control. You want the patient to be able to make the decision that affects both her pocketbook and her health. Studies show that when you do it that way, you actually lower cost and preserve access to quality care. One thing I've learned in my 20 years is that politicians overpromise and underfund. And if you rely upon the bureaucracy to make the critical decisions regarding your health, then you are at the mercy of the wisdom of that bureaucracy.
I mean, Bill, everything I'm reading is we got all kinds of problems. I'm hearing about rationing of medications by 7 or more states. And more problematic than that is that we have a shortage of doctors with the number of folks who are getting care already.
So the president, of course, one of the big things he pushed was lowering costs. As it turns out, costs have risen even since he passed his legislation.
And I think it's 1.7 by the Congressional Budget Office is expected to be 1.7 trillion more expensive than he told us it was going to be.
That makes sense to me, and there's some things that he did not address. For example, something called the SGR, sustained growth rate for physician wages under Medicare. But that said, there are ways to do that. There are ways in which you empower the patient to make decisions that are wiser, and so she picks insurance programs which are less costly but still afford her family access to quality care. Now, the president's health care plan actually discriminates against those sorts of programs. I actually think it moves us in the wrong direction, taking freedom away from families, giving it to a bureaucrat, which means if a bureaucrat has freedom, you don't.
Well, my impression is we're giving control of cost to the government, who never controls cost in anything, instead of giving control of cost to the individuals as you're discussing. Let's talk about the fact that, because as I'm understanding it, and you're in the medical profession, doctors are now starting to say, I'm not even going to participate in this type of medical care. Too much headaches, too much paperwork, too much regulation, not getting paid enough. I'm either retiring or I'm not messing with it.
You know, Locke, you're right on. So although originally the president said he was about controlling costs, because that's what polls show that the American people want, his plan really focused on expanding access. Okay, so getting people who are uninsured into the insurance market. The Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government cannot force states to expand Medicaid if they choose not to.
Great ruling.
50%,
in that regard.
50% of the expansion of coverage is through Medicaid. Now, as it turns out, let's imagine that the states did obey the federal master. 31% of doctors in a recent poll said they cannot afford to see Medicaid patients because Medicaid pays them so far below their cost of doing care.
So they lose money.
So there, for example, in California,
good God,
a dentist gets paid $12 to see a patient. There's no way a dentist can pay his hygienist, pay his receptionist, his electric bill, and his rent for $12.
I can't get somebody to mow my yard for $12.
You cannot buy 2 hamburgers with fries and drinks for $12. And this is in California. So at some point, low payment means no access. So he talked about coverage. The coverage that this plan provides oftentimes is the illusion of care without the power of access.
That's exactly right. And let's talk about you brought it up, that the Supreme Court in its ruling flat out maintained the state's sovereignty.
Right.
And the federal government, it said, cannot force states to do this, and it can't punish them by taking away federal funds if they don't do it. So there's not even the practical infrastructure there to implement Obamacare if states pull out. And I know several have already said, we're not doing it.
So a couple things about that. One, I'm a freedom guy. So the federal government over the last, probably 100 years has been taking more and more freedom both from states and from individuals,
That's right.
coercing both to do the will of the federal government.
That's right.
You just see that more and more and more. The president's health care plan was just that with an exclamation mark behind it. The Supreme Court, as you said no, you cannot coerce states into doing this. Now some folks are saying, wait a second, shouldn't states just take the Medicaid expansion because it is free money? It is free federal money.
Free.
Well, first, it's not free. It belongs to the taxpayer that's being funneled through. But what I am told is that in the first 5 years of implementation, the free money coming down from the federal government would cost Louisiana taxpayers $650 million.
I read the same thing.
So it's $650 million from state taxpayers that will be required if they implement the federal program with so-called free money. I don't know if our state can afford that.
So the bottom line is, not only does the practical implementation tools exist via the states if they opt out, but there's not even the resources allocated to implement it.
Well, there's resources allocated. You're just going to take them from roads. You're going to take it from prisons. You're going to take it from education. Nationwide, Medicaid is a program, for the viewers who may not be familiar with it, which was created as a safety net for poor people. When I work at Earl K. Long Hospital, many of those patients have Medicaid. Now, they're not in the private sector because Medicaid pays so poorly, they have a hard time finding physicians who can afford to take them. But that said, it's an important safety net program.
Right.
But it
And we
has-
want the safety net for folks who really need it.
who really need it. On the other hand, it has expanded so much that beginning about 2 years ago, for the first time, states spend more money on Medicaid than they do on primary and secondary education.
Good Lord.
Now, to lift people out of poverty, we need education. But that trend line is going to continue where there's less for education and more for Medicaid,
Wow.
which means that ultimately everything
Our
is...
society collapses
Yes.
if we can't educate our youth. Tell me what then, because the House has actually, passed a law or an act that repeals Obamacare, but that's going to go nowhere with the Senate being controlled by the Democrats and, of course, President Obama. But assume for me that somehow Obamacare is repealed. What are the Republicans proposing to replace it?
Great question. There's three components to the insurance market, if you will. There's Medicare, which is the program for older folks, which is going bankrupt by 2022, which frankly the president's health care plan arguably makes that worse. There is Medicaid, the safety net program we just discussed, and then there's the private insurance market. For the Medicare program, Republicans have advanced something, actually it's bipartisan. Ron Wyden, liberal Democrat from Oregon, Paul Ryan, conservative Republican from Wisconsin, have authored something called the Wyden-Ryan Plan, based upon something that John Breaux and Bobby Jindal put together about 10 or 15 years ago. It would preserve Medicare exactly as it has been for those on it and those who will be in 10 years, and it will strengthen it so folks who are 54 and below will have something to rely upon.
And then, as I understand it also, competition is introduced into the healthcare
Yes.
system where insurance companies compete in every state if they want, which drives quality up and prices
Well,
down.
both competition in the Medicare market, which again, the patient has the power, but also in the private insurance market. In the Medicaid arena, there's several kind of bills to reform that. I have one called the MAC Act, if people want to look at it. So we have reform for Medicaid, and then lastly, for the private insurance, it'll be a patient-centered approach. Patient has the power, not the bureaucrat.
Excellent. Bill, thank you so much. Appreciate it. This is Locke Meredith, Legal Lines, and our special guest, Congressman Bill Cassidy. Thank you for being with us. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me, frankly, for 3 shows that we're very fortunate to have done with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy of District 6 here in Louisiana. We have elections coming up in November 6th, and we want to make sure that you folks are making educated decisions when you vote, that you know what the issues are. So Bill and I discussed all the big issues ranging from the jobless state that a lot of us find ourselves in, to the huge debt that we have, to immigration policy, national security issues. So join us on the next Legal Lines with our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and this is really a continuation of 2 previous shows. It's with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. Bill, again, let's just keep plowing through it. We're trying to educate folks on the big issues so they can make an educated decision come voting day on November 6th. That's what this is all about. So we were talking about Obamacare and kind of the consequences, which frankly in your evaluation, and you're a doctor who's been caring for the poor for well over 20 years, isn't going to accomplish, number one, saving money, much less providing quality care to everybody.
You said earlier we don't have an incidence of the federal government saving money in a health care program, but for some reason we're supposed to say, well, that doesn't matter, now we're going to. I think your assessment is the better one, which is they never have, probably won't.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good indicator.
Now that's important to me because I've noticed working at Earl K. Long, when the state resources grow scarce, the lines grow longer. If you will, it is rationing by the line getting longer, having to wait for that needed service. So I'm afraid that that will begin to impact more and more of our healthcare system.
And of course, that's indicative of what we see in Europe, where they have kind of socialized medicine, or Canada, where it takes months to get the kind of test, to see a doctor, and to ultimately get surgery or a particular treatment, right?
Yes, it's interesting that right when the healthcare bill passed, there was a political leader in Canada who had a heart valve problem. And if he had it in Canada, they were going to crack his chest wide open and he was going to be out of work for 6 weeks. He flew to Miami, had it done by a minimally invasive procedure, and was back at work the next week. Now, the Canadians do a better job of controlling cost. We do have issues regarding making insurance more affordable for families and small businesses, but there are ways that have been proven to do that are different than the approach taken by the president.
Well, and we talked about it in the previous show, but let's just reiterate it real quick. I mean, putting the government in charge of controlling costs just seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
And the Republican plan, or the conservative right, whatever you want to call it, plan is to give the individual the power and the freedom of choice of who gets their medical dollars. And they benefit if they get the service provided at a cheaper but quality service.
If you allow that, typically it's the woman that makes decisions for a family. If you allow that mom to make decisions and she knows what the price is of something before she goes in there and she's got the good policy, then she is going to make a decision that's both good for her family's physical health and their financial health. You see that over and over. You see it not just with the one-time case, but you also see it in studies that show how you can lower costs.
And so competition is kind of the backbone, as far as I analyze it, in the alternative to Obamacare, because it's creating competition between the insurance companies. They don't have a monopoly in every state. They have to compete with all the insurers in all the states. So they got to be doing it at least as cheap as most of them out there and provide a quality service. Plus there's competition of each of those companies to get the client.
Yes, and there's a couple other things we have to introduce. There needs to be price transparency.
Right.
Somebody needs to know what the knee surgery is going to cost before they go in the hospital, not find out what it costs 6 months later.
We don't care right now what it costs,
Right.
because we pay our monster premium, and whatever they got to pay, they got to pay.
Yeah.
We need to change that.
We need to change that so that if my doctor, I'm a doctor, but if somebody orders an x-ray of my shoulder, I can use my smartphone, go to a code, flash it, the insurance company says you can get it there for $50 or you can get it there for $150, and the quality rating is the same at both. Now,
And the individual benefits by the cost savings.
yeah,
because
so
their premium stays.
I'm going to pick the $50.
That's right.
And so same quality, lower cost, we need to have that sort of economy so that, again, the mom making decisions about her family's health is equipped to make the right decision.
Bill, let's shift gears. But there was this momentous decision, probably 1 in 100 years event that occurred when the United States Supreme Court held Obamacare, or most of it, particularly the mandate, constitutional. You and I discussed before the show kind of my analysis of it, but let's discuss that. What are your thoughts?
First, I'll say I was so privileged. I actually got to sit in the Supreme Court the day that they argued the individual mandate.
Fantastic.
I'm not an attorney, but as an American, you're in there and you realize that in Iran or Syria, if you disagree with the government, they take you out back and they shoot you. In the United States, we may disagree, but these 9 men and women come in, make a decision, and we may continue to argue, but we will live with that decision.
We're a country of laws.
We're a country of laws, and I will just tell you how proud I was to be an American. Now, that said, the Supreme Court upheld the mandate not as a fine, but as a tax, and it limited the ability of the federal government to coerce states into doing something which the state does not wish to do. If it's just outright coercion, above a certain level, the federal government cannot do it. What I enjoyed, though, was your kind of take on how Roberts may be preserving freedom.
Well, maybe I'm trying to find a silver lining in a dark cloud, but I find it very interesting that via this decision, he has maintained the independence of the Supreme Court and the power of the Supreme Court. They basically said, we don't care what you call it, President Obama and Congress. You may call it a penalty or a fee or whatever. It's a tax. And because you have that power to tax, we're going to uphold it. It also upheld the conservative principle that the courts should not be legislating from the bench. Their job is to see if the legislation was passed under the powers enumerated by the Constitution, and if those powers exist, to uphold it, not to find a way to get around it and shut it down. And so I liked that component. So it preserved the power of the Supreme Court. And you indicated earlier, it also preserved the sovereignty and the power of the states, because it basically said, hey, you can't force them to implement this, and you can't punish them. And that was wonderful. And it preserved the freedom of us as individuals. It did not expand the Commerce Clause so broadly that the federal government can compel individuals to buy something or do something or penalize the inactivity. And I think that's very powerful. And then finally, he preserved the power of Congress. By calling it a tax, he preserved the power of Congress and the whole nation, because he's saying, look, it's not our job. If you don't like this, then you elect people to repeal it. And you have that power, people. You have that power, Congress. Deal with it.
I've been consistently impressed with the American people since I've been in political office. And I like that. The one quote I remember was, it's not the job of the Supreme Court to prevent the American people from bad public policy. They need to put in different representatives to give them better public policy. I'd like to think that Justice Roberts was calling this bad public policy, but there was the left of the bench that was joining him, so maybe not. But the point is, it's now the American people's responsibility in this November.
That's right.
To figure out, do we want the president's health care plan, more taxes, more intrusion upon our life, or do we want more freedom and a different sort of approach to get at the same goals?
And it's interesting because it introduced, in a way, a political element. I mean, now the court has said it's a tax, and so either the Congress and the president were wrong, or some would say lying, about what it was.
By the way, it was the Democratic side of the Congress, not the Republican.
That's right. And it's also created a practical problem in its implementation if states say, sorry, we're not doing
Right.
it.
Now,
and so it has huge consequences.
and people point out that this is the first time such a major social program was passed without a single Republican vote.
And that's just not the way it should be. So we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith on Legal Lines. Our special guest, our United States Congressman, Bill Cassidy. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and I have our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. Bill, let's dive right back into it. Let's educate the folks about the issues. Obamacare, as you've indicated, took away $500 billion from Medicaid. Is that correct?
Medicare.
Medicare. What are the consequences of that?
Well, Medicare, according to the actuaries who are appointed by the president, is going bankrupt around 2022. So Medicare is the health care program for those who are 65 and above. Now, it's going bankrupt. The hospital trust fund for Medicare will have no money. By law, we're not supposed to transfer general fund dollars to the hospital trust fund to cover the shortfall.
Wow.
So the question is, how do we address that?
How do we address it?
So Ron Wyden, I mentioned on an earlier segment, a liberal Democrat from Oregon, Paul Ryan, a conservative Republican from Wisconsin, have put forward a plan that builds upon something that John Breaux and Bobby Jindal, two Louisiana people, put together advanced 10 or 15 years ago. And in that, if you're 55 and above, which means if you're already on Medicare or will be within 10 years, nothing changes. For those of us who are 54 and below, it changes to something called premium support. I pick the insurance company I want. The federal government will send a check to that company that I pick. No one can refuse me based upon my health. If I pick a frugal plan, I may put money in my pocket. If I pick a bells and whistles, I may have to pay.
Gotcha.
If I'm poor or have lots of disease,
Got the safety net.
the federal government will continue to pay for 100%. By doing this, Nothing changes for those 55 and above. The program is preserved. And for those of us who are 54 and below, it'll still be there when we get there.
And it's means tested?
It'll be means tested, so the rich will pay a little bit more and the poor will have everything paid for.
Okay. Let's talk about Social Security. It's similarly in significant problem state.
And we should tell people, Locke, folks say, man, I've been paying in this my whole life. Why is it going bankrupt? Well, it turns out baby boomers did not have as many children as their parents.
And there's a lot of us.
And there's a lot of 10,000 baby boomers a day go on to Medicare. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And most people have more brothers and sisters than they do children. So instead of having a population curve that looks like that, with lots of young people paying for the few that are old, it's a program that looks more like that.
Bill, I read that in the 60s, 1960, there were about 7 workers contributing to the system for every retiree. Now, it's about 2.5.
Yes. I thought it was even lower, but the
It may
point
be.
is, it is greatly contracted.
So we got much less in terms of funds going into the program,
And people are living longer.
and many more people drawing down on it.
Yeah, so we have to preserve it. So for Social Security, what Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, Republican president, Democrat leader of the House of Representatives, did was they said, okay, we're going to increase the age of eligibility a little bit, not for those close to retirement, but for those who are about 30 years old now. So you have 35 years to plan for this change.
You know, Bill, as we talk about all these issues, it just screams in my head. Our children have a heavy burden on them.
They do. They do.
They have a very heavy burden on them in every respect.
Yes. And so all the more reason for us to get it right. We want our children to be more prosperous than we. And so we have to get this right.
Yeah.
Now we could, increase the age of eligibility from current maybe 67 to 69, but again, start so that if you're 30 years old today, you go onto Social Security 1 month later. And if you're 29, it'll be 2 months later. By doing that, we can rescue Social Security for those who are going to be on it within the next 10 to 15, 20 years, and for those who are on it now.
Now, I recall I think, that there was a discussion about offering an alternative option, which is invest in your own kind of private retirement system, not be forced to give the funds to the government, but be able to invest it in your own. Am I wrong?
There was those things advanced. Frankly, they've fallen a little bit into disfavor since the stock market crash of 2007.
The reason I bring that up is because what I've read recently is, up until this year, 2012, for example, 1960, I think you got up to 7 or 10 times the amount of money you paid into it.
Yes.
You drew it out. Now, you don't even get what you pay into it.
I think put it this way, most people who take from Social Security, who get benefits, will receive more than they paid in. Okay, first say that. But that said, yes, indeed, if from 1965 until 2007, you had put your money in a private account, you probably would have had a better rate of return.
And that's the issue.
But in 2007, 2008, 2009, there was such a fall in the stock market. I think that, again, that's kind of made people have second thoughts about that avenue.
Interesting. I still say we shouldn't abandon an analysis of that. Let's shift gears again. Let's talk about security, national security. It's a big deal. We've got wars everywhere. We've got a porous border on our south with Mexico. Let's talk to the folks about what's going on. Energy and debt that causes national security concerns.
First thing that comes, again, a recurring theme in this conversation, Locke, has been our nation's debt. Admiral Mullen just retired as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said the greatest threat to our national security is not Al-Qaeda or radical Islam or China. It is our national indebtedness. Now, this is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which points out the importance of controlling our national debt. Again, both for our children and grandchildren's prosperity, for our own prosperity, but also for our national security.
And Bill, the reason he's saying it's a national security concern is because there's not enough money to fund our military?
The military is only a product of a vibrant economy.
Right.
At some point, your economy becomes weighed down if the federal government is sucking up all the capital that ordinarily would be going into investment.
Well, and what I've read is the cliff that we talked about, the financial cliff, also includes taking $500 billion from the military, which means removing one carrier and not having a force sufficient to occupy if it was necessary.
The problem, if you will, with how this is being done, which is, by the way, the Congress, the House of Representatives voted something like 233 to 2 to ask the president to tell us where he's going to make those cuts. And the Senate voted unanimously, every Democrat, every Republican, to ask the president, because he wasn't telling people where the cuts were going to be. So companies were sending out layoff slips because they didn't know. So not only
and compelled by law to do so,
compelled by law to do so. So the president, by not being forthcoming, was creating more uncertainty, which is creating the threat of greater job loss. One of the problems with our economy right now is that there is just uncertainty making people not want to invest. So if there's cuts in the military, they should be planned for in a reasonable way, not like, we're not going to tell you. Now, in fairness, the president just signed it. Now, granted, if he didn't, it would have been overturned, his veto would have been overturned. But within 30 days, we'll finally know where those cuts are. They should have been planning for this 6 months ago.
Well, I guess there's a concern that if we're borrowing trillions of dollars from other countries, we can't necessarily maybe flex our muscle on other issues, trade or otherwise, because they may say, you know what, we're not going to loan you any more money.
Clearly, we have to make an accommodation with China because China has so much of our debt. And so I think what you're saying, Locke, is absolutely right.
Well, I think I actually read too that they now can go directly to the Treasury and buy the debt. They used to have to go through a middleman. That's been eliminated because they said we don't want to do it anymore. Very interesting.
Yes.
Very interesting. Well, let's talk about the national security concern regarding immigration.
Oh, yeah. Clearly, immigration, we have a porous southern border. We've got to do something about it. First thing about security is controlling your borders.
No doubt about it. And I know we talked about putting a fence up and doing other type of virtual monitoring. So we'll continue this on the next segment.
Okay.
This is Locke Meredith with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of myself, Sean Fagan, and Corey Ogeron, and our entire staff for letting us come into your homes for the last 10 years via Legal Lines. We hope that you've come to a greater understanding of how the law works and how the government works for you. So from all of us, thank you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, again with our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. Let's dive right back in, Bill. We're talking about national security concerns. You talked about debt and how that's a national security concern. We have talked already a little bit about the energy issue, but cover that briefly with folks. Why is that a national energy concern?
Right now we import about 40 to 42% of our oil from OPEC nations. A lot of that oil goes through the Straits of Hormuz. If Iran says they're going to shut down that strait, then they effectively will put a choke on our ability to import oil. One of the reasons that conservatives want to have domestic oil and gas production and the conversion of some of the things we now do with oil to natural gas.
I think that's a big deal.
It creates American jobs, American royalty payments. People pay more taxes not because of higher rates, but because they have more money.
Reduces our debt.
It reduces our debt, strengthens our currency, and also strengthens our energy independence.
That's right. We're not capable of being held hostage.
Yeah.
Or they raise the prices so high that we collapse economically.
So maybe we pay a little bit more, but if we're using domestically produced natural gas,
money stays here.
Money stays here instead of OPEC oil. Less money goes to nations that hate us, more money to American citizens.
All right, let's talk about the border on our south. We started to hit that a little bit, but where are we? I mean, you know, the Homeland Security folks act like they got it covered, and then you hear about the implementation of what appears to be the DREAM Act, which Congress hasn't passed by DOJ, and folks are being allowed to come through just by saying I'm in high school or want to be.
Yeah, so first, there's actually less illegal immigration than there used to be, but the reason for that is that our economy is doing so poorly that
they can't find a job.
They can't find a job. Now that's the wrong reason to control, the wrong way to control your border.
That's right.
Secondly, though, the DREAM Act is where some people have proposed that if somebody came here illegally as a child, no fault of their own,
right, have no control over
and now they've integrated into the American society, that they should be allowed to effectively go to high school, college, and not be deported. Some would go all the way to make this a pathway to citizenship. Now, this has been debated in Congress. And under our Constitution, this should begin in Congress and go all the way through to be fully debated and appreciated by the American people, and the President would sign into law.
And I know President Bush, I think, tried to do this, and John McCain, the senator, tried to do it, and the ultimate conclusion was, you guys secure the border first, so we know more folks aren't coming over illegal and taxing, our education system, our medical system, our employment system, and all that. And also, we don't have terrorists pouring in here to shut us down if the cell's activated, because nobody wants to punish kids who were brought over here by no fault of their own.
Now, I'll tell you that there are conservatives on both sides of this issue. The Wall Street Journal actually favors the DREAM Act, and there are other conservatives that say no, they're illegal. That's not the point in this discussion, if you will. 2 years ago, the President was asked, President Obama, what about the DREAM Act? He says, well, it has to go through Congress. I cannot take it up on my own. About 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, he effectively tried to implement the DREAM Act bypassing Congress. Whatever we think about the legislation, constitutionally, it should go through the Congress. He is usurping that constitutional power, frankly, I think, for short-term political gain.
Well, Bill, it's very disturbing, and I've actually talked with other folks about this in other shows, that President Obama has appeared to have taken a lot of steps that are unconstitutional, that he does not have the power to do. For example, DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. He says, I don't like that, I'm not enforcing it. I'm telling the Department of Justice, do not go after anybody in that regard. This immigration policy, the DREAM Act, there's other provisions of other laws, no child left behind, and other instances where he picks and chooses what he likes and he doesn't, and he decides whether or not to force it. That is not defending and preserving the Constitution of the United States. That is not his job to pick and choose. That's Congress's.
Theoretically, he is the executive and the head of the executive branch that executes the laws passed by Congress. And so he may or may not like the laws, but he is supposed to execute them as they are passed.
His only involvement would be signing off after Congress passed it. Once it's been signed off by our previous president in Congress, he doesn't have the power to decide.
Well, he can implement and come up with ways of interpretation, and that's practically happening, but he's not supposed to just turn his back on it and choose not to. And he has done that on more than one occasion. If you're a person who likes constitutional limits to what each branch of government can do, we discussed that earlier.
Absolutely.
You would be disappointed in this president.
Well, and let's talk about the very unsavory matter of the Attorney General Holder. He has been the first Attorney General in the United States history to be held in contempt of Congress. Explain to folks briefly what happened. It has nothing to do with Fast and Furious. It's him not respecting the power of Congress.
Yeah. The background, of course, that it does relate to Fast and Furious in the sense that the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, had a program approved by Department of Justice in which they allowed weapons to be sold to Mexicans to take across the border to be used in their gun...
By drug cartels.
By drug cartels. There has been... The Justice Department was asked by Congress to give documents relating to this as part of Congress's role to oversight, to provide oversight to the executive branch. The Department of Justice has refused to do so. And frankly, it looks political. They don't want to be embarrassed. The Congress finally was going to hold them in contempt, and the President said it was executive privilege. You're an attorney, you know better than me, but I am told that it was a stretch to say this was executive privilege.
Right. So there was a vote, and of course the reason they don't want to be embarrassed is because hundreds of Mexican citizens have been killed,
including,
and we had a United States border.
A United States agent was killed with one of these guns that was sold illegally. They could have caught the people buying them illegally, but they let the weapons go across the border.
Horrible situation.
Horrible situation.
Let's shift gears real fast. Louisiana coastal erosion, it's a big deal. I had no idea. We're losing almost 25 square miles a year of Louisiana land.
Yes, and that impacts us all. It impacts both where people live. So if you go down to coastal parishes, there is saltwater intrusion. Oak trees that were beautiful are now dead. Think about Hurricane Katrina. One of the reasons its impact was so terrible is that the coastline which would have buffered it has been lost. I'm going fishing with a friend this weekend, and he'll show me on his GPS device, this green is where there was land, and now it's open water.
Wow.
So it's that fast.
It's horrible.
If
So we
we
got
don't-
some funds?
We are getting some funds. The BP oil spill will have huge Clean Water Act fines associated with it.
That we're getting that money.
Congress passed a law, the president signed it. 80% of those fines will go back to the Gulf Coast states to be used as each state sees fit. In Louisiana, that will be related to reversing environmental damage.
Excellent. Bill, you and I have discussed Sheriff Sid Gotro here in East Baton Rouge Parish and Chief Dwayne White. The chief has told me he needs 200 more police officers. The sheriff has indicated he needs 100 deputies, and Hiller Moore, who is our district attorney, they have all implemented a program called BRAVE, and they are seeking a $1.5 million grant from the federal government. As I understand it, you can do everything in your power for that to happen.
Absolutely. We have a woman in my office, Dale Marino, who does grant writing. Now, as it turns out, there's a certain amount, it's not earmarks, it's what the federal government puts out there for competitive grants. And ideally, the person with the best idea gets the money, and what we learn is used elsewhere. Somebody's going to get that money. We want it to be here, and we're going to help them as we can.
Bill, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Locke.
coming for another show. We look forward to being with you again. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines, our United States Congressman Bill Cassidy. Thank you for being with us.